Time now for Focus, and today we have a report on opposition to Emmanuel Macron's plans to reform French labour laws. This a day before the CGT union stages nationwide protests. A declaration of war is how it's described the government's measures to liberalise the country's jobs market. Question is, how many people will take part in tomorrow's strike? Previous presidents having caved into pressure from the streets. Karina Chabour and Aurore Dupuis sent us this report.
Contre la loi travail, on est là. Contre les capitales qui en fera la peau. Dans le bonheur et la joie, on est là.
They want President Macron to scrap his economic plans, too draconian for them. These protesters fear that staff could be fired too easily and that labour unions will have less power to help employees. The population is divided. Macron's reforms were a key campaign promise.
Why all this mayhem here in Jouy-en-Josas? You should have thought about voting for the right candidate in the first place. All of a sudden, nobody supports Macron?
I didn't vote for Macron because I knew I'd be taking to the streets. But you have to respect those who voted for him to prevent the far right from winning. They're honorable people too.
This is the first demonstration against the bill. Their aim, disrupt the summer convention of the MEDEF, the employers' union.
À ceux qui veulent rallonger le temps de travail.
We want to go to those who called for the executive order that will break the labor code, as in the MEDEF, the employers' union. It's in Jouy-en-Josas for 2 days, and practically all members of the government have joined them. We're launching a wave of social movements.
Around 300 people have taken to the streets, but they've been stopped opposite the prestigious business school HEC. At the employers' summer convention, more than 7,000 businessmen are discussing the future. They seem pretty optimistic and hope that France's economy will keep improving.
There are so many reforms to carry out. I hope Macron has the courage to fully put them into place.
Today we see that some of the promises made during his campaign, namely reducing payroll taxes, have been pushed back to 2018, maybe 2019. That's a problem, because businesses would have liked to benefit from it straight away.
Macron won't attend the MEDEF's convention, yet his reforms are on everybody's mind, including the boss of the bosses, Pierre Gattaz.
I'd like us to keep our positive vibes and to start a new era. After 30 piteous years, now we want to head towards 30 audacious years.
Gattaz wants President Macron to go the extra mile. With the help of fellow businessmen, he's compiled 60 ideas to revamp the jobs market.
Ridding ourselves of pessimism, that's the goal.
It's fundamental, we're up for it.
For him, the labour reform is only one step forward.
We have to aim for an unemployment rate of 5%, not 9%. We have to push for reforms that will enable us to build trust and boost enthusiasm. With our employees, we need to build France's future. It's not one camp against the other. It's not about bosses against employees. It wouldn't work otherwise.
With his economic reforms, Emmanuel Macron hopes to cut the unemployment rate to 7.5% by 2022. In this village in northern France, joblessness is at 20%, double the national average. This leisure centre offers cultural activities to children. 145 families take their kids here. Today, it's an art workshop. A banner urging the French government not to scrap state-funded contracts. 5 out of 6 employees could lose their job next spring.
Parents living in towns nearby all bring their kids here. So if the centre shuts down, what activities will the children have left?
Such contracts are largely funded by the government. They're supposed to help long-term job seekers like Carmen Burles. At 54, she could soon lose her job.
It has allowed me to get back to my working life. It had been too long since I last had a job. I've been lucky to get this contract with kids and great colleagues. I couldn't hope for a better situation.
The French government wants to reduce state-funded jobs to 310,000, hoping to save 1.5 billion euros. The leisure centre's manager says the Labour Ministry notified her of the decision via an email at the very end of the summer break.
Due to budget restrictions, we're forced to review the number of contracts renewed this year. We didn't get an email telling us that we have the funds to keep all these job positions. We're not the only ones to have received this email. And there are other priorities for the government. For example, social services, retirement homes, etc.
Faced with job cuts, the leisure centre could be left checkmate next autumn. Another company struggling to make ends meet, GM&S, a car parts supplier. Staff protest in front of the factory of their main client, Peugeot. They're greeted by the car maker's managers, who deny being responsible for their economic woes.
We're not here to fight. The fact that the riot police is here, it's normal. They're just doing their job, but they're not doing their job. They should be at the factory working.
GM&S is the second private employer in the Creuse region. The French government has tried to help find a new buyer, but workers are not satisfied.
There used to be 600 employees at the site. Now we're only 277, and tomorrow we'll be 120. For a region like ours, where there aren't any jobs, it's tough. What are we going to do? What are we going to become?
We're going to join our colleagues. 80 people are waiting for us over there. We sleep in the truck. We want to stay here all week. We have blankets and mattresses.
At 54, Didier Soulas has worked 36 years at GM&S.
I'd like to get some training, but what am I going to do? Truck driving? I don't have enough experience for an employer to give me a full-time job. We're here. It's up here.
Protesters block the entrance of the factory. The government has vowed to help and train 157 workers set to lose their jobs.
Macron told us he's not Santa Claus. I don't know if he'll help us, but I don't believe in Santa.
In the meantime, these protesters say they will not back down until their demands are met.
Nicolas Vinick joins me now in the studio. He's a politics reporter for Politico in France. Hello, thank you very much indeed for your time. Now, with the CGT planning demonstrations tomorrow, I'd just like to start off for people outside of France. If you could just tell us just how powerful is this union?
The CGT has the most representation in the public sphere. It's very present in all sorts of crucial industries, and they're also most powerful because they have the best ability to get people out in strikes and in protests. But they have lost a lot of their clout over the past 5-10 years.
And President Emmanuel Macron isn't going to even be in the country tomorrow. He's going to St. Martin. He won't be here for the demonstrations. Is that a sign that perhaps he's not all that worried about mass protests?
I think it's a sign of just what he thinks of this particular union not being here to address their concerns directly. He feels that these people have isolated themselves. There are 4 other major unions, 5 in total in France. All the 4 others have agreed to not to protest, and so the CGT is going alone. And I think you're right. Yeah, I think that the Macron is not overly concerned about this protest, or indeed other protests scheduled later for later this month. Mm-hmm.
I'll come to that in just a moment. I'd like to talk about Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but you mentioned the other unions that have decided not to join forces with the CGT, and that is because they were consulted over several weeks. The unions and the Employers' Federation were consulted by the government. So we've had the Force Ouvrière even say that this is a real consultation and a social dialogue that has never been seen before. Is that really the case then, that this whole procedure has been quite unique?
Well, you have to wonder what the Force Ouvrière was given in order to make such a positive comment. Force Ouvrière is usually on the same hard line as the CGT and would usually be the first out onto the street to protest against this type of reform. What was clear is that the negotiation process here was fairly effective. There were months of closed-door, entirely secret meetings between the government and the unions, met the unions one by one, and offered them perhaps counterparties, perhaps gifts or enticements in exchange for their support for this reform. We don't know exactly what they are, but there are whispers. The nationalization of the STX shipyard in Western France was seen as a gesture towards Force Ouvrière, and that might explain why most of these unions are not joining in the protest, even though this is the biggest revision of the French labor code in the post-war period.
How does it compare to the El Khomri law that was introduced last year and sparked lots of protests, quite a lot of heavy opposition?
It is more of the same, but it goes much further. Essentially, what we have here with this law is inverting the hierarchy of labor norms. So instead of referring first to a national labor code that's going to regulate all labor relations, you're going to refer first to negotiations inside the company. And of course, that gives the unions much less leverage against company bosses because the negotiations are happening in one particular firm and not on the national level. And the El Khomri law took a step in that direction, but didn't go quite all the way. And here we have many measures that were delayed or put aside exactly because they were too controversial during the previous term, are now part of this labor reform. And the employers' union is getting most of what it wants.
Now, as you mentioned, there aren't just protests planned for tomorrow, the 12th of September, but also the 23rd, and that's Jean-Luc Mélenchon spearheading that rally. He's the head of France Unbowed. Why have two different protests, and what do you think the government makes of them? How do they compare?
Well, I think that's the first thing we should note is that there are two different protests, and it does sort of blunt the impact, blunt the potential of the protest to be divided in this way. The unions and the far left, or what you could call the Communist Party, or the far, or what it's become, the far left forces in France, should be marching together against a center left or a centrist government trying to reform the labor code, and that hasn't come together in this particular case. There's been tension between the leader of the CGT movement and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's going to be the leader of protests against Macron, and they haven't come to an agreement. And this is time and time again with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, where he won't play second fiddle to anybody else. And as a result, you've got two entirely different days of protest, one which is going to drain the energies of the working class, of the unionized class, and another which is much more focused on the students who will be protesting after university classes begin again. But they're not going to be at the same time. There's going to be fewer people in the streets and less disruption for regular workers, and ultimately less problems for Macron and his government.
Now, if the streets can't stop Macron and his government, can anyone? Because these reforms are being pushed through by decree.
Absolutely. There will be no debate in Parliament about these. What you could say is the government is determined to push through these decrees no matter what, but there is a little wiggle room as to what exactly goes into them. And that's what we're going to see this month. If there is momentum, if there is a truly large-scale national movement against this law, the government will start to scratch its head and say, is it worth the political cost? And where can we give way? Where can we give a little wiggle room so that we don't end up paying a nasty price for this? But so far, it doesn't look like that momentum is going to come together against these laws.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time and your analysis. Thank you for watching. Let's go to a break. I'll be back at the top of the hour.